Hi, I'm Emma. Now my dad's gonna read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson.
All right, guys, so I'm going to read the story, follow along with the text as I read, and then afterwards there's some questions, and I'll go over the questions later. Okay. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square, between the post office and the bank, around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking amongst themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers or sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place with his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was hesitation before 2 men. Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present black box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year, at the lottery, Mr. Summers began thinking about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood cut, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had thoroughly with his hand. all had been forgotten or discarded. Summers had been successful in having chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, the village was tiny, but now that the population was 300 and growing, it was necessary to use into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers made the slips of paper and put them in the box, Summers Coal Company, and locked up until Mr. Bates had taken it square the next morning. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves's barn, and another year underfoot in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Summers declared the lottery open. The make-up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household, Mr. Summers as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remember, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that held off duly each year. Some people believed the official of the lottery used to stand, so when he said or sang it. Others believed he was supposed to walk. But years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute. The official of the lottery had each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time. It felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at in his clean white shirt and blue jeans. With one, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves, and just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders and slid into place at the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mr. Delacroix, who stood next to her, bothly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking woods," Mrs. Hutchinson went on. "It was running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking